You're listening to a podcast of Master Your Finances with me, Kurt Baker, a certified financial planner professional. Sunday mornings at 9 a.m. on 1077thebronx.com.
Another day, another dollar, and our certified financial planner professional, Kurt Baker, will give you the tips you need to turn that single into a sea of green with Master Your Finances. Whether you have enough to get by or too much in your pockets, Kurt Baker and his weekly guests are here to show you how to manage it all. Master Your Finances is underwritten by Certified Wealth Management and Investment LLC. Now listen up, because it's time to get a hold of those money matters and master your finances.
I am Kurt Baker, a certified financial planner professional located in Princeton, New Jersey. I can be reached through our website, which is www.cwmi.us, or you can call me directly at 609-716-4700. And this week, we're very pleased to have with us Mollie Sperduto, who is the founder of Ginger Ninja Productions. I love the name. A company that provides stand-up comedy shows for fundraisers as well as private and corporate events. A comedian herself for over 15 years, she works with a vast network of performers to put shows together for every kind of audience. She's also flexed her creative muscles in theater, film, singing, and voiceover work, and is thrilled to have created a life for herself where she can live her passions. I love that. To me, I talk about this all the time, like do what you love and you'll never work a day in your life. And I think a lot of people get kind of tied into these tracks where, oh, you're going to be whatever. I hate to pick on certain industries, but like a physician or an attorney or this and that. And you're like, if you don't like it, I mean, if you love it, great. But if you don't like it, don't do it, right? So I guess because you're doing your passion, I'm kind of curious, how did you find your passion originally and then actually turn that into a business, which is two things that are kind of cool when you put those together?
It's a little bit of a long story, but I'll try to keep it reduced. But I had always been interested in performing. I had, as a very young child, always been involved with the choir, school band, show choir, like everything imaginable that you could. Like I rang handbells too, like because it was a thing that I could do to perform. And I learned not only that I enjoyed being on the stage entertaining, but I also liked making people laugh. And one day the opportunity presented itself to try to put two and two together. There was some, listing in the newspaper for like one of those first night New Year's Eve type shows where they were looking for all sorts of different types of performers. And one of the things that listed that they were looking for was stand-up comedy. So I went, I'll make an audition tape. I was 15 years old. I put together what I thought was a pretty good stand-up comedy routine. I filmed it in my living room in front of my fireplace with three of my friends and my mother in the quote-unquote audience.
That's great.
The audition went about as well as a 15-year-old doing stand-up for the first time in their living room in front of four people, so I did not actually get the part, but I absolutely loved the idea of doing this. And so even though as a 15-year-old I had other priorities of getting through school and eventually college, I couldn't work on it full time, but it was something that I never stopped doing from that point. Even if I was performing only a couple times a year, I was still always thinking about it, always trying to write, always trying to think of opportunities. And in time, I learned that a lot of the shows that I was performing on were being run by my own peers in the business. And I like the idea of being in charge, even in other jobs that I've held. I've tried to climb up the ranks a little bit to have, higher positions with more responsibilities. So to apply that to stand-up, which is my first love, kind of seemed to make sense for me. So I gave it a spin. I tried to run my own show, and I love doing it. So again, one of those things that you start doing and then you never stop doing.
That's great. So it sounds like you've always been funny and always entertaining.
Funny is a subjective term.
So you're one of those cute kids that everybody came over and said, oh, wow, let's watch.
Well, truth be told, and I think that this can apply to a lot of comedians, is that when we're not performing, we can be very reserved. More often than not, I get people saying, oh, I would never think you're a comedian if I'm talking to them in just a casual circumstance. But, as soon as you get on the stage, everything comes out.
Oh, that's pretty cool. Okay, so you can have like two different kind of personalities, like you have what you would love to do. You get on the stage, and they. I guess I hear that a lot, like actors. I've heard some actors saying they're. I'm trying to remember who it was. I don't know. I think it might have been Barbara Streisand or something. He's like terrified of audiences, but once they get out there, they're fine. I think McCarthy might have said that too. It was kind of like some really big stars. They're like terrified because they're very different off stage. But once they're there and they get into that entertainment mode, it's like a whole different thing, right? They just turn it on and it flows and they enjoy doing it, right?
Yeah, and ironically enough, one of the things that, spikes my anxiety is being in a crowd. So I haven't. There's a joke in here somewhere, and I haven't written it yet. But but in a way, part of me wonders if I started to get into stand-up and into performing to get away from crowds, so that I could be on the stage away from them.
Oh, there's more room up there.
Yeah, exactly. You got your space. No one's allowed to come around you. And people go like, "Oh, you're so brave for doing stand-up. I could never do that." I'm like, I'm running away from my fears right now.
Right. Oh, that's pretty cool. Okay, so you started doing some of your own shows, right? So what types of shows did you start doing initially, and then how did you get into like helping other people with the shows? So how did you start? What types of shows did you do? Because it sounds like you've done a lot of things. There's a lot of pieces that come together. So you kind of honed your talent. You started doing some shows. You started learning. I'm sure there's a learning process in here somewhere, right? I mean, this is, because not everybody succeeds at this. I think it's kind of interesting that you followed your passion, but you were able to step your way through some of those very competitive. It's a very competitive area, right? Entertainment.
It is, and it is, but at the same time, with comedy, especially as a producer, there are still very few of us that do to the extent that I do. So there's some competition, but I also think that there's plenty enough work to go around that we don't need to be, undercutting each other or anything like that. As a comedian, as a performer, there are so many out there of all different varying levels of talent. It's very hard to gauge objectively. So on that sense, it's correct that it's kind of challenging to go through just as a performer. And the types of shows that I performed on, mostly a lot of independently produced shows. So not necessarily a lot of the comedy clubs, but if XYZ person was putting together this monthly show at this bar in, this town, that would be the type of show that I would wind up performing on. And I had started to put together my own show, and it was, a Sunday night gig at a dive bar on the outskirts of New Brunswick. So look at me bragging. And it was, a weekly thing for a while, and it was also, in a crazy way, being in the right place at the right time, because I started running this show as soon as I graduated college, and I graduated college in 2008. So middle of the recession. On one hand, daytime Molly is sending out my resume to everyone to try to, get the job that I went to the school for, that I got the degree for, and not hearing anything from anyone, because at that time nobody wanted to hire anyone for anything. Meanwhile, I was running this Sunday night show, and I'm promoting it on Facebook and getting a lot of feedback from people going, "Oh, I didn't know you were running your own shows now. My brother just opened a restaurant. We have a cafe. This guy down the street has this place, blah, 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 blah." And I went, "Oh, so there's a demand for this." And it was, again, being in the right place at the right time, because on one hand, I'm not getting any feedback whatsoever from the, quote unquote, real jobs that I was trying to go for. Meanwhile, there were people that wanted me to do this thing for them that I'd wanted to do all along. So for a couple years straight, it was work begets work. I just told people that I was running shows, and a lot of them were smaller scale, like coffee houses and bars and restaurants. So not, a lot of them are mom and pop places. So I'm not putting on, a wholly professional show with, the type of headliners that I work with now. However, it was still, they were still shows. It was still giving me the experience that I needed, and it still entertained people, even if it wasn't your comics with years and years and years and decades of experience. And after a couple years of doing that, I had kind of stopped to re-strategize, because I was chasing my tail trying to run shows at the local coffee house, or what restaurant could I look at, but I want to do something a little bit bigger with this. And that's when I figured out how to start marketing, to do fundraisers, to do corporate events, to do private parties. And when I started looking for work again and running the business full time, I had, from a procedural perspective, I was doing the same darn thing that I always did.
Right.
But it was just, my marketing tactics and trying to figure out how to get the word out to the people that I now wanted to do shows for.
Right. So did you ever get involved in the job that you're actually trained for at college, or did this kind of just take over?
I mean, yes and no. My major was journalism and media studies.
Oh, so that kind of fits in, right?
Yes.
So.
And I have done a couple of one-off things, like actually just this past month, I did a show for a VFW up in North Jersey, and as I was trying to put out some promotions for the show, I look up local newspapers and stuff to try to see if I can get the word out. And they had a local newspaper in town that, for any event information or anything you want to promote, send it to this email. So I did. And this woman was super friendly, comes back to me, goes, yeah, we'll promote your show, and if you want to take any pictures, send them to us, and we can do a write-up on it afterwards. So I grabbed some pictures, and I told my clients, I'm like, I could put my journalism degree to use and do a little write-up for you guys about the show. Just, I wasn't there for it myself personally, because I was in a couple places at night, but I'm like, give me some key details, I'll make it look nice. I went to school for this. Right. So, graduated in 2008. In 2019, finally applied it.
No, that's fantastic. But no, it's good you got the training still applied from college. So once you started formulating as a business, and we'll talk about that a little bit, like how you formulated. You went from taking the opportunities into actually running it like a real full-time business. It sounds like you had a transition there, and we'll talk about that a little bit when we come right back. You're listening to Master Your Finance. Welcome back. You're listening to Master Your Finances. I'm here with Mollie Sperduto, and we're talking about how you started, basically turned your passion into a business, your talent from performing, and then you started doing the actual shows themselves. And it sounds like initially you just found some opportunities. You realized, hey, wow, people really want to do this. And then it sounds like a couple years in, you decided, okay, I'm doing these different events. That's okay, but now I want to turn this into a real business. And,
right.
And I know a lot of times that happens, especially with the arts and things where people are like, oh, this is a lot of fun. I enjoy it. This is great. I'm making some money at it. But if you really want to monetize it, you have to kind of think of it from that business perspective. So when was the point where you said, and how did that kind of happen where you go, I think I need to do it? And you came up with the ideas of doing, the fundraisers and stuff. So where did that all come from? And then what did you do when you realized that's a good idea? How did you actually take those steps to turn it into a business?
So, first and foremost, I would be remiss if I didn't acknowledge the fact that I had mentors.
There you go.
And they had both held my hand through the process as well as pushed and shoved me through the process, proverbially speaking. And a lot of, because there are a number of folks out there that work as headliners, and I think it's a little bit to their benefit as well, because the more people booking shows, the more people that can book them for shows, and folks that like to perform but don't really like the business end of it are more willing to want to train someone else to do it. So I had a lot of folks that were showing me the way and still impart their insight on me to this day. And so there was always that idea that I could do something with this. It was just a lot of what held me back was, I guess a lot of folks, and when they're kids and they have an interest in the arts, the biggest piece of advice is, oh, you have to find a fallback, which is something that I did because that was just, what you did, unless you were in LA and going on like acting calls and things like that every day as an 8-year-old or whatnot. So in my head, I always just had this idea of I'm going to have a career somewhere. I don't know where, but I'll be doing stand-up at night or whatever the case may be. And so, again, once I had graduated college and once I started running the show and once I started not finding a job in this field that I studied to be in, and, this was the life path that I thought I was supposed to follow that was written for me, I started to run the shows that people were starting to come to me for. And I like to do everything kind of the right way, like by the book. So as I was, charging a cover charge for these folks, for people that were coming to see the shows and making, the teensiest amount of money from it to start, I'm like, oh, I'm making money. I need to do this the right way and make sure that I'm doing taxes and register myself as a business and blah, blah, blah.
Right.
So I did that. And yeah,
Good for you. Not everybody does that.
12 years of Catholic
That's
school
good.
have made me
That's good. That's smart.
so guilty of doing anything wrong. But so once I had done that, I'm like, oh, well, now I have a business. And at that point, I'm like, I should be doing things for my business now that I have this business. And so, and mind you also, at this time too, I did have a day job, because once I realized that I wanted to do something with this, I'm like, all right, switch gears. Let me just find any job. Doesn't have to be in my field, just a job that will free up my nights, give me a paycheck and some health insurance, and let me figure out how to make this work. Because it was around the time that I had registered it as a business and had people asking me to run shows for them at that point that I realized there's something here. I don't know what. I have never thought about running a business or being a business owner in my life right up until right now. So I need to figure a few things out. So I took some local entrepreneurship classes. The Small Business Development Center is a major help if anyone is looking to start a business. Small plug. And had figured out at least a launching pad from where to start and figure out what it was that I even needed to know, because it was definitely a you don't know what you don't know sort of situation there. And it was right around at that point, I guess, that might answer your question of when I realized this is what I want to do. When it came to the turnaround of when I wanted to switch from the smaller venues to the larger scale events that I do, that was, I think, always an end goal for me, because even as I was running these like coffee house shows and stuff, I kind of had in mind that I wanted to start looking up like different nonprofits to do fundraisers. And I had started to put a little list together, but I'm like, I don't really know how to approach them right now. And I was also being kept very occupied because the folks that I was running shows for, there weren't too many of the venues, but they were frequent. So it was monthly or bi-monthly or weekly. So they were keeping me busy on a regular basis for about 3.5 years straight. And it was when my final client that I had, it was like a coffee house that they were sunsetting and going out of business. When they cut ties with me and I had no other folks that I was running shows for at the time, that was when I went, I could chase down the next coffee house, or I could take a little break and figure out how to bring this up a level. And the break may have been a little bit longer than I planned, because I get distracted by a lot of other creative ventures. It was around that time that I started getting into voiceover work as well. But eventually it happened, and I had been able to put enough resources and knowledge together to finally be able to quit that office job and run the business full-time doing what I'm doing now.
Well, that's great. And I think that's very wise that you, I always believe in like multiple streams of income. And that's kind of what you're doing, is don't just jump out on the entrepreneur ship, so to speak, without having some type of income while you're doing. Because you need to support yourself at the same time. And I think sometimes people call that Plan B, but I kind of call that like your base. I mean, you need to have some kind of base if you're going to be an entrepreneur because it takes time. I mean, even a good business is going to take a couple of years before it really kind of sustains itself in a major way, unless you're lucky and you create some like app on a phone that like all of a sudden takes off in a week. But for most people, you have to anticipate a couple of years. So you want to have that. And I think that was really smart. And then you set it up right. One thing I'm very curious about, because I have a nonprofit ourselves, I think we had this conversation at the chamber. And I just think it's interesting you approach nonprofits because, like we get approached all the time. And the first thing about nonprofits is, well, every little penny we're pinching really, really hard. So when you approach them, they're kind of like, okay, because now you're dealing with a committee, right? Usually, even a smaller nonprofit, you're always dealing with a couple of people. I just think it's an interesting area where people target nonprofits only because I see it from the other side. And I know as an entity, it can be kind of hard to break into it. One, they don't have a whole lot of extra cash flow, most of them. They're always being very careful. They all want to raise money, so they're all interested in raising money. But at what cost, right? They're always like, okay, if I'm going to do this, you usually have to put money up front, and you have to you're basically taking a risk. So I guess one, how did you think about the nonprofits, first of all, and then how have you progressed? How do you talk to them to tell them, hey, this is how it's going to work, and this is why you as a nonprofit might want to try something like this?
So to answer the first question, it was to be frank, it was an easy way for me to get started on trying to branch out into this realm of it, because when it comes to like corporate events or private events, it becomes a lot more difficult to find who those people and you can't just do a corporate event for, the local Joe's Deli down the street, but you have to find businesses that are large enough to sustain something like this, and then you have to figure out who within them to speak to, whether it's sales or HR. So with nonprofits, you can find lists of them disclosed online where you can sort it out by a whole number of different criteria. So it makes them a lot easier to look up and to figure out who would be best for you.
Right.
And as far as the approach, I usually try to alleviate some of that by letting them know, like for certain shows, this would be the number of tickets that you need to sell in order to break even, and then beyond that is what you would need to turn a profit. And I always start with that before getting into any other numbers or details, because if I say, just using something completely conflated to as an example, but if I say 5 people is your break-even point. You sell 5 tickets, and you will break even from.
At least we don't lose money.
Exactly.
That's a good place to start from.
If you bring in 10 people, then you can double your money.
Right.
Now there are some organizations out there where, say, 3 people sounds like a struggle to them. I'm like, well, now you know that this probably isn't going to work for you, and I'm not looking to set anyone up for failure. That's not what I'm here for. So I'm like, this is what we're looking at. If all of your other events that you ever pull together only bring in 2 or 3 people, then this 5 people is going to be a struggle for you. And we might want to look into other options from here. If someone's saying, oh, well, we bring in, 10, 12 people to every event, maybe something like this, we could even bring in like 20 people, then yes, this is for you.
Right.
So I try to approach the conversation that way, just to kind of be realistic about whether or not this would benefit you before going all salesman and being like, these are all the benefits and this is why you should hire me.
Right. Well, thank you very much. We'll talk a little bit more about that when we come back. You're listening to Master Your Finances. Welcome back. You're listening to Master Your Finances, and I am here with Mollie Sperduto, and we've been talking about how you got your business going and how you decided to deal with the nonprofits because you could get the information, right? So that's all. Most people don't realize nonprofits are actually public entities.
Yes.
Nobody owns them. So we have to disclose everything pretty much. There's no secrets with a nonprofit. All our records are open. You know who the board of directors are. You know who the president. You know everything. I mean, you really do. And you know like where they get their funding and how they get whatever they get, which I guess is good. And it sounds like that was easier than the corporate world, where that might be harder to go to like a J&J and say, hey, we're going to put on an event for you, because they might have their own people doing it, or they may have somebody they've been doing business with for 20 years, right? And then your smaller deli people you mentioned, they're like, well, why am I going to do this? It's, you know, I'm selling sandwiches. I have no interest in this kind of stuff. So you got to kind of find that middle area. But nonprofits need this, right? So
Yes.
We're all looking for ways to raise awareness, which an event always does that, because you get people together. So you have community, which every nonprofit wants to have that get together of all their volunteers and their donors and all these people in the same room, because that kind of helps with the mission. And then, of course, you want to raise funds. So I'm just kind of curious, what types of events have you found kind of work for them, right? Because there's all types of, I mean, you keep hearing about different things. Like I heard, we were just having a conversation about this yesterday, like I don't know, golf outings are great if they're established, but if you try to create a new one, it's really hard because golfing is on the decline. And we hear all these conversations. These things are good. We do like an eating event, a Taste of Hope, which is a bunch of restaurants and, you know, things like that. And I know our Knights of Columbus does something probably similar to what you do.
Right.
And they do like a magic night, or I forget what it is, trivia night, these different types of things. Comedy night, we've done that over the years. I'm not directly involved in all those, but I know somebody actually sets these up. So how do you have that conversation about, well, here's your nonprofit, right? You know, what are they going to be interested in maybe seeing, right? Because one of our conversations with them was like, well, you can do comedy, but we're at a church, so certain things we really don't want you to. We don't want you going in certain places.
Absolutely. Although it's
right.
funny because I did a show about a year or two ago for Knights of Columbus.
Okay.
And always very clearly communicate beforehand what type of show that they're looking for. And for them, you know, we weren't doing it at a church, we were doing it at their hall. And they had said, you know, an adult show is fine.
Okay.
And so I'm like, okay. And, you know, just still keeping in mind that it's a Knights of Columbus, so certain, you know, hot button religious issues might not be good, but rated R show,
Right.
okay, I'm on it. I get there, I start to set up, and there's a priest sitting in the front row.
Okay.
And I, you know, again,
Because your 12 years of Catholic school coming back at you.
froze. And it didn't, this is besides the point of the story, but it didn't
Right.
help that I actually knew the priest as well.
Oh, you did? Oh, my goodness.
He was at my church for a couple of years. But I go over to my client. I'm like, hey, let's talk, shall we? She's like, sure. I'm like, you said adult show, right? She's like, yep, no one under 18 is coming in. It's all adults. We're fine. I'm like, there's a priest in the front row. She goes, don't worry about him. I went, okay. But he liked it. He came up to the comics afterwards, was asking them questions, was like really engaged in the show. So, you know, it was fine. But that one probably threw me for the biggest loop.
I'll bet. So you have a conversation ahead of time to find out what's appropriate. So
Exactly.
when you do recurring events, do you kind of come up with like different ideas? Because I know one of the things we talk about is you want to have some consistency, but it's entertainment, right? So you have to kind of make it a little different, new, refresh, because you want to bring your people back. I know with our events, we're always thinking about certain things you want to keep the same, but then you want to make it a little different. So each time somebody comes, like, oh, wow, that's really cool, right? A little bit.
I think when it comes to this, it can absolutely be the same format of
Right.
an evening. If you do, like, say, dinner and a show, or
Right.
you have like a tricky tray that you do at the end, or whatever the format
Yeah,
of
the
the show
format will be
is.
the same, but the content, the experience
Absolutely.
will be slightly different.
Yeah, I definitely make sure that all the comedians that are on the show are completely different from the year before.
Mm-hmm.
And, you know, for a show that recurs for a long enough time, I can take some notes as to, you know, which performers they seem to really like more than the others, and, you know, bring them back after a couple of years. But for the most part, they're getting a different show every time. It'll still be stand-up comedy. They'll still be sitting down and watching the same format of a show and the same, you know, idea, but the material is all different. So...
Okay, well, that's really cool. So, so for the nonprofits, do you work with other people other than nonprofits, or you mainly just focus on the nonprofit world?
Mostly nonprofits. I do get the occasional, like, one-off, like, corporate event or, like, private club event. Mm-hmm. But for as far as what I do the most of my marketing to, it's nonprofit organizations. And it was interesting because I had, when I had first started to kind of market myself, the idea was, I'll stay kind of in my remote area, the surrounding like 6 counties or so, and work on nonprofits. And then when I get the swing of that, I'll start figuring out how to reach out to do more corporate events, and I'll expand that way. And after, a year or two of doing nonprofit events, I went, no, I really like this. I like the philanthropic aspect of it. I like being able to use what I'm most passionate about to be able to help people get the resources they need to also help people. It's like a little nesting egg of
Right.
kindness.
Oh, no, it's a very important part of our economy. I mean, nonprofits do a lot of good work as a group. It's a huge amount of work that's done through nonprofits. And, they always need awareness. They always need to fundraise. So what have been some of your more successful events, and have there been any surprises when you started dealing with nonprofits? Anything that came up that maybe a little different than you expected?
The most memorable event that I have, hands down, it happened this past summer. And actually, it was also tangentially a Knights of Columbus sponsored event. But earlier this year, a gentleman that had seen one of my shows and had been in contact with me a couple times since reached out to me saying that his friend's daughter was in a very bad car accident, like a lot of incredibly serious injuries that she is still recovering from to this day, unfortunately. And there were different fundraisers being held for her, like a GoFundMe page and a whole slew of other things. And he had said, I want to put together a comedy night to raise money for her. So we did that, and not only, there were a couple of different, because he is with the Knights of Columbus, so he had a couple different chapters helping him out, and a couple of them offered donations separate from the money that they were raising from ticket prices, and they did a tricky tray, so they overall brought in something over $15,000 in a single night.
Oh, that's great.
And the best part of the entire night was that, so we were on stage, and the table to the left is this woman's family and friends. And it wasn't until, I pointed it out in a very indiscreet way, that her daughter had her on FaceTime, so she was watching the entire show from her hospital bed. Like, I had started to go off on a premise or something, and then I heard some stirring from the table, and I'm like, oh, what's going on here? Like, I don't know, she's watching it, and we had to tell her something. I'm like, she's watching the show, and everyone applauded for that, and any attempt for them to be discreet about it was completely destroyed at that point. But just looking over and seeing her laughing face through her daughter's phone was the best thing to happen at a show in years.
Right. Well, that's amazing, right? Because you want to, entertainment. I mean, there's nothing like a good laugh to make you feel better, right?
Exactly.
'Cause, I know we talk to kids, we talk to young kids, and we talk about even like a fake laugh. Even if you don't think anything's funny, you just start laughing, like a hearty, not like a ha-ha, but a real laugh. It actually releases hormone. It releases,
I read that.
yeah, and it actually makes you feel better. So they even say if you're feeling down, just do a fake laugh, because you'd be surprised it'll elevate you just a little bit. So comedy is huge, I think, and I think sometimes people don't realize just how important it is to really get a good laugh, right, and get yourself away from the stress. Right, it's too much negative information coming at us, I think, and I think you need to turn that off.
Yes,
Give
absolutely.
yourself a break and come over and really enjoy yourself, because most of what happens out there is positive. You wouldn't know that if you started watching, like TV or listen to radio. I mean, you hear about all that, the breaking news kind of stuff, right? Like the scary stuff. But that's not really the world. I mean, it's actually a pretty good place. And I think we need to kind of remind ourselves with these types of things.
Yeah, and it's interesting to that point. I read this a while ago, so I only remember the basic details, but I think it was like a newspaper in Australia that decided one day to only publish good news, and the circulation tanked.
Right.
Because people just kind of want to see the sensationalist train wreck, and I don't know why, but it's just...
Well, that's the formula, and I've read this once, is if you look at the tabloid magazines on the way out if you actually look at it, it's the same subjects every single time. there's just a little slightly different twist because the format works.
Right.
And that's the same thing with newspapers. The format works. Unfortunately, it has to give you scary headlines. And sometimes you read the headline and then you read the actual article, and it's like two different. You're like, where did that headline come from? Because it doesn't match the article at all. But that's the formula. And so I think we have to we have to be in charge of that and really kind of turn that stuff off, at least sometime. You can't, in my view, it's too toxic to watch it all the time because it'll kind of overwhelm your senses if you're not careful.
I agree.
But all right, you've been listening to Master Your Finances, and we will be right back. Welcome back. You're listening to Master Your Finances. I'm Kurt Baker here with Mollie Sperduto, and we've been talking about like the events you did. And I thought that was fantastic. The young girl who was tragically in an accident, but she was able to watch your show from her bed at the hospital, and it kind of surprised you a little bit.
Oh yeah.
That's kind of cool, right? So you see the recipient of the benefits of your work, like right there, listening to you perform as you're kind of putting this whole thing together. So that has to make you feel really good. And I agree with you. People that work with nonprofits, we hear this all the time, is that you feel like you get more out of the volunteering than you're giving because you get all this emotional, connectivity and, to the cause. Whenever you're part of something a little bigger, I think that always makes you feel better about what you're doing. So I know that was one of the events. So what do you see kind of happening? Are there many changes in the industry, or what do we see has been going on lately in as far as the industry goes with nonprofits and trying to put on events like that you've been putting on? What have you seen? Anything?
As far as the events that I'm doing, I feel like something's going to brew, but I'm not quite sure what just yet. And I know that there's even just like the structure of how we do things. Someone just shared an article with me today about how they're trying to crack down on the gig economy.
What does that mean? The gig economy? I mean, like not gigabytes.
No, like gig workers, like
doing an
Uber
event,
drivers and things like that.
Oh,
too.
Interesting. Oh,
and I think this is mostly for like Uber and Lyft drivers, but it could potentially have some impact on folks because I work with comedians other than myself.
Oh, this is where they want them to be considered employees instead of 1099 contractors.
Exactly.
I know that's a big thing, especially in New Jersey, because our Department of Labor tends to really lean towards the W-2 designation, much more than most states.
Right.
So if that's the case, and I've heard a little bit about that, I wouldn't be surprised if New Jersey's like on the cutting edge of that because it's kind of like you're an employee unless you can prove otherwise.
Exactly.
Basically.
And there's like I said, literally this morning, there's a Facebook post that I've been tagged in that is probably going on as we speak.
I think the legislator is running something right now. Yeah, that's my understanding.
So, I mean, from that standpoint, it's kind of up in the air. But I feel like if I sat down and looked at it, there could be ways to work through it.
I think you can because you're a company and you can have a part-time, you can have a limited relationship with people. I'm sure there's going to be mechanical ways to do that. The difference is going to be, of course, now you have to go through that process of processing an actual payroll instead of just handing them a check, saying, "Here, Susie, here's your check." And so, well, here's Susie, here's your check minus your, your deductions.
Right.
And then you're going to have to pay your portion. So the pricing is going to have to be adjusted so it all still works because there's a little bit more of a cost overhead. And I think the reason for that, honestly, is that a lot of your self-employed people are not properly withholding like they're supposed to. So now they're in danger of not being ready when they're 67 years old or whatever the case may be because they're not setting aside enough through their self-employment scenario. So, I mean, and I think that's the reason they do that. I mean, I'm not going to. I don't really know the data, but I know that's the argument. The argument is, well, they're not actually doing enough of that themselves, so we're going to kind of make sure it gets taken care of.
Right, and I feel like there's at least 6 different sides to this that I haven't taken the time to actually sit down and look at it yet, but now that it's a glaring part of the news, it's maybe in 2 weeks I'll let you know what I found out.
Yeah, but I don't think it's. I don't think it's gonna. I think we're going to adjust. Honestly, I think there'll be like this adjustment piece as far as how all that has to get done. I don't think it's going to materially affect anybody long term. It may affect us short term because we have to make some adjustments. But hopefully, I mean, that's my hope at least.
Right.
So now we have the ways we may have to compensate people or how they have to be set up. Now maybe they have to be set up as another company because another company should be able to still do that, right?
Right. That's also true.
Yeah. So if they set up their own little LLC, if they do enough of this, they may do what you did, right?
Right.
Good Catholic girl, you set up your actual company. So now you can just do it that way, right? You can just business to business. I would think would stay the same. I would suspect, right?
I believe so.
It should.
Yeah.
You can't pay a W-2 to another business.
Exactly.
That doesn't. I've never heard of that. That's not going to happen, right? So how you book them? So now when you have all these people, so how do you find all your talent, so to speak, and how do you kind of sift through that? I mean, to me, that sounds like a little bit of a challenge. You're like, you're a talent person, right?
So I guess the beauty in being a performer as well is that most of the folks that I work with, it's a network that I've amassed just from my time performing, and I do still perform. So I try to keep myself the performer, myself as the producer is two separate things. Not every show that I produce is one that I'm necessarily performing on. Not every show I perform on is a show I've put together.
Okay. So do you book yourself?
Oh yes, I can book myself whenever I want. So as a performer, I also get the opportunity to sometimes see comedians that I have not worked with before, which for me is great because then, I'm there as a performer, I'm still doing what I like, and I get to see other people that I might be able to use as a resource.
Oh, that's great.
And I think if I were just on the booking end and didn't perform, then it would be a little tiring, for lack of a better word, to be going to like new talent nights or whatever, or other shows to scout.
Okay. So you're scouting by actually being part of the show. That's kind of cool.
Exactly. And then also, as far as a way that I think comedy is evolving outside of some of the mechanical aspects of it from a booking perspective is, and I think this doesn't just apply to comedy. I think this applies to kind of the workforce at large. But with comedians, there used to be hierarchy. I guess for lack of a better word, where you would start going to the club, the comedy club, and working your 5 minutes, and then eventually getting promoted to MC, and then to feature act, and then to headliner, and you just worked your way up this ladder. And now, especially with so many different social media channels, and the gatekeepers aren't there as strongly as they used to be. So there's like I'm trying to think of an example. There was a show on, I think, CBS many years ago, like Bleep My Dad Says with William Shatner. And it originated from this guy's Twitter account where it was, of the same name. And it was just him quoting his dad on his Twitter. And it was funny. I followed it as well. And I think he may have had some connections, some pre-existing connections, but they turned his Twitter account into a show.
That's amazing.
And
I've never heard of that before.
Yeah, and there's so many other ways that you can make yourself known as and to succeed in the business that isn't just going up that pre-designated path.
Are there any trends in comedy? I mean, you hear about trends in music, you hear about trends in like movies, and are there any trends, or is it all still pretty much whatever that audience might want? Because the content, it's always about creating content, right? So I'm just wondering what the people that are creating this content, what their thoughts are. I mean, you have to go through this process of saying, what do I think is going to be funny? What are people going to laugh at, right? How am I going to entertain them?
I think
Does that change?
Maybe a little bit. This was another thing I read about this some time ago where, about 20 years ago in, the Jerry Seinfeld era, the 90s, a lot of people were looking at comedy as an escape. So that's a lot of the comedians of that time had a lot of, observational humor and, the Jerry Seinfeld, what's the deal with airplane food and things like that.
The show about nothing.
Yes. And there seems to be a more growing demand in this day and age where they look to comedians to explain things for them, for lack of a better word, where, I don't really have to point out the obvious and say that we're in a bit of a crazy time right now.
Comedy's good right now.
Yeah. And so they, like with things like The Daily Show with Trevor Noah, and for a while, Amy Schumer's show was quite insightful towards some of the issues that, especially ones that women have been talking about in recent times. And so there's this subsection of people that want to have comedians interpret what's going on in the world.
Right.
And so there's a need for that, but I still think that there's also a subsection of people that are still looking for that escape. And that tends to be a lot of the people that I work with the fundraisers, especially because in a very divisive landscape that we have, if people are paying money to see a show that's going to raise money for a good cause, they are looking to simply be entertained, full stop. They don't want to...
They want to leave the daily life for a little while and get away from all that a little bit, right?
Exactly.
Go into like another world that's a little happier.
Yeah, they're not looking to be challenged. They're not looking to leave with their mind changed. They just want to come for entertainment and to support a good cause. So that tends to be a lot of the audiences that I work with my business. But from the larger perspective and from the digital perspective too, because I think the other difference is that people that come to my shows are kind of being held captive to whatever the show is going to give them, whereas someone that has beliefs in one direction or another can just go online and find the thing that they want that's going to interpret the thing that they want.
Right.
If they don't like it, they can change the channel or go to a different website.
Right. Well, we really appreciate it. Entertainment is very important, and we all like to laugh. And when you can laugh and actually raise money for a good cause, what better way could you do it? I really appreciate you coming on today, Mollie.
Thank you.
You have been listening to Master Your Finances, and you can listen to this podcast and all the podcasts we have by going to masteryourfinances.us. And remember, together we can master your finances so you can enjoy financial peace of mind.